On October 27, 1962, in the suffocating heat and darkness of the Caribbean Sea, inside a Soviet submarine armed with a nuclear torpedo and cut off from all communication with Moscow, one man sat at the center of a decision that could have ended human civilization in a matter of minutes, and that man was Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov, a name the world barely knew until decades later, but whose actions in that chaotic, pressure-crushed moment prevented the escalation of the Cuban Missile Crisis into full-scale nuclear war. The sanitized version of the story, the one most people hear, goes like this. An American destroyer dropped signaling depth charges to force a submerged Soviet submarine to surface. The submarine's captain believed war had already started, and Arkhipov refused to authorize the firing of the nuclear torpedo. That version is true, but it is also only the surface. The full, unfiltered story is far darker, far more complicated, and far more terrifying, involving a breakdown in Soviet command structure, catastrophic mechanical failures, psychological collapse among the crew, miscommunication at every level, and the brutal, unrelenting pressure cooker environment of a submarine that was never designed to operate in the tropics. To understand the impossible decision Arkhipov faced, you have to start with the submarines themselves. The Soviet Navy had sent 4 Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarines, B-4, B-36, B-59, and B-130, to the waters around Cuba as part of Operation Anadir, the secret deployment of missiles, bombers, and troops meant to transform Cuba into a forward Soviet base. These submarines were not nuclear-powered, like their American counterparts. They were cramped, noisy, undercooled vessels that relied heavily on battery power and had to surface periodically to recharge using loud diesel engines. In Arctic waters, they were barely tolerable. In the Caribbean, they were hell. Temperatures inside reached over 120 degrees, 49 degrees Celsius. Humidity condensed into sheets of sweat that dripped off ceilings, mold-coated walls. Carbon dioxide levels rose dangerously high anytime the sub remained submerged for more than a few hours. Crewmen fainted from heat exhaustion. Others suffered hallucinations. By the time B-59, Arkhipov's submarine, was detected by U.S. forces near the quarantine line around Cuba, its crew had been submerged for over 48 hours. Its batteries were nearly depleted, and many sailors were on the edge of collapse. And inside this overheated, suffocating steel coffin sat a weapon powerful enough to ignite World War III, a T-5 nuclear torpedo with an explosive yield between 10 and 15 kilotons, roughly equivalent to the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. Soviet commanders had told the submarine captains that if they believed a war had begun, they were authorized to use their nuclear torpedo. But here is the part almost no one outside of military and intelligence circles knows. The rules for launching that torpedo were not consistent across all 4 submarines. In most Soviet sub-deployments, only the captain had authority to launch torpedoes. But because of the special weapon on board, the nuclear torpedo, the Soviet General Staff issued a unique regulation. 3 officers had to agree to launch, including the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander aboard the submarine. On B-59, the flotilla commander was Vasily Arkhipov. Without his approval, the nuclear torpedo could not be fired. And at the height of the crisis, both of the other officers wanted to launch it. Captain Valentin Savitsky, exhausted, dehydrated, barely able to think clearly, believed war had already started. He had not been able to contact Moscow for days. The radio antenna had been damaged. The submarine was being rocked violently by what the Americans thought were signaling depth charges. Small explosives meant to force the submarine to surface, but not harm it. To the crew inside B-59, however, they sounded like active attack detonations. Men screamed orders through smoke-filled corridors. Heat levels rose so high that metal warped slightly. In that chaos, Savitsky reportedly shouted, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy." The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, agreed. 15 kilotons of nuclear firepower now depended on a single dissenting voice, Archipov's, and Arkhipov refused. But his refusal did not come calmly. It came after hours of heated argument inside a submarine that was literally running out of breathable air. Crew members were vomiting from stress and heat stroke. The internal temperature was so high that some sailors were unable to touch certain metal surfaces without burning their skin. The air was thick with diesel fumes, battery acid vapor, and carbon dioxide. Men were hallucinating shadows moving in the corners. A few had collapsed entirely. And in this environment, Captain Savitsky did something even more horrifying. He attempted to prepare the nuclear torpedo for launch without unanimous consent. An act so severe it could have triggered a mutiny or a physical confrontation inside the submarine. Arkhipov stood between Savitsky and nuclear war, not just diplomatically, but physically, forcing his voice and authority into a moment where panic had replaced logic. To understand why Arkhipov had the resolve to resist, you have to look at the event that shaped him more than any other, the K-19 disaster of 1961. Arkhipov had been deputy commander on the Soviet nuclear submarine K-19 when a catastrophic reactor failure threatened to ignite a meltdown that could have wiped out the entire crew and contaminated the North Atlantic. 8 sailors died from radiation exposure after improvising a cooling system without protective gear. Many others suffered permanent damage. Arkhipov witnessed firsthand the disintegration of command under extreme pressure, the way panic infected at WW3's submarine like a virus, and the horrifying consequences of decisions made without clarity. He also saw the importance of calm leadership. K-19's crew avoided total disaster only through disciplined, collective action at the edge of death. Arkhipov carried those lessons with him into B-59. So when the captain and political officer demanded nuclear retaliation, Arkhipov refused, not because he was certain war had not started, but because he did not trust their judgment at that moment. He had seen what panic could do. He argued that they must surface, re-establish contact, and verify the situation. He insisted they follow strict protocol rather than emotion. He fought against 2 officers, the heat, the chaos, the pressure, and the very real possibility that the Americans were indeed attacking. And slowly, painfully, he prevailed. B-59 surfaced, nearly blind, its crew pouring onto the deck gasping for fresh air, surrounded by a ring of U.S. destroyers, who, to their shock, watched a Soviet submarine rise from the depths without firing a single shot. The world now knows that nuclear war was avoided in that moment. But here's the part almost never discussed. The Soviet Navy punished Arkhipov and the crew when they returned home. They were not welcomed as heroes. They were interrogated, reprimanded, and threatened. Senior officers accused them of embarrassment, of cowardice, of failing their mission. Some were demoted. Others were quietly reassigned. Archipov's career stalled for years, long before history caught up and recognized what he had done. The full magnitude of Archipov's decision was not understood until decades later, when declassified documents revealed just how close the world came to nuclear annihilation. Closer, in many ways, than during the peak of the Cuban Missile Crisis itself. And that is only the beginning of this story. In the days after B-59 surfaced in the Caribbean, the submarine's crew found themselves face-to-face with American destroyers illuminated by powerful searchlights, surrounded by dozens of sailors staring in disbelief at the battered, heat-scorched Soviet vessel that had nearly launched the world's first underwater nuclear strike. And while the Americans had no idea just how close they had come to total destruction, they did know something was wrong. The Soviet sailors stumbled out onto the deck drenched in sweat, some collapsing from heat exhaustion, others barely conscious, their uniforms soaked through, their eyes bloodshot from carbon dioxide poisoning, and their bodies shaking uncontrollably as they gulped fresh air after nearly 2 days trapped in a floating furnace. Yet even then, Captain Savitsky and political officer Maslenikov were still furious at Arkhipov, refusing to acknowledge that their impulse to launch had been suicidal. And this simmering tension continued as B-59 was escorted away from the blockade line and allowed to retreat into deeper waters where it could recharge its batteries and regain some semblance of operational control. But the psychological trauma of those hours did not fade. Several sailors later admitted they thought they were going to die, and many believed that surfacing meant immediate capture or execution by the Americans, which amplified the chaos until Arkhipov reasserted order with a calmness that stood in stark contrast to the near mutiny that had occurred below deck. What makes this moment even more haunting is the fact that Soviet command in Moscow had no real understanding of the hell these submarine crews were enduring. The Foxtrot-class vessels had been designed for cold, deep Arctic waters where condensation, battery heat, and CO2 buildup were manageable. But in the Caribbean, with water temperatures reaching 85 degrees, and ambient air trapped inside the submarine rising far beyond survivable limits, the boats became death traps, and the conditions grew so severe that lubricants ran off machinery, electrical panels malfunctioned, and food began to rot inside storage compartments. Some sailors later reported that the air tasted thick, like a mixture of metal, sweat, and burning insulation, and that every breath felt like inhaling through a heated cloth, while officers had to ration water so tightly that many aboard became dangerously dehydrated, losing weight rapidly and suffering migraines so intense they could barely think straight. To understand Arkipov's mindset during this crisis, historians have pointed to his upbringing and training. Born in 1926 to a peasant family near Moscow, Arkhipov grew up during Stalin's purges and World War II, experiencing firsthand both the terror of political repression and the devastation of German invasion. And when he joined the Soviet Navy as a teenager, he was molded by an institution built on harsh discipline, ideological indoctrination, and relentless emphasis on obedience. But he was also recognized early for his unusually calm temperament, his strategic judgment, and his refusal to panic under stress, qualities that instructors noted repeatedly during his military education. These traits became even more apparent during the K-19 disaster the previous year, when Arkhipov, then serving as deputy commander, coordinated emergency efforts that prevented a catastrophic reactor explosion that could have rendered much of the North Atlantic uninhabitable, and many survivors credited Arkhipov with maintaining cohesion as crewmen suffered severe radiation burns, vomiting, hair loss, and internal bleeding. That experience hardened Arkhipov, but more importantly, it gave him a perspective that most Soviet officers lacked: the knowledge that disaster often grows not from malice, but from fear, confusion, and fragmented leadership, and that acting rashly in the face of uncertainty can be more destructive than taking no action at all. When B-59 finally regained mobility and began its journey back to the Soviet Union, Arkhipov knew his decision had potentially saved millions of lives, yet he also understood that Soviet leadership was unlikely to see it that way. Within the rigid hierarchy of the USSR's military structure, success was measured in obedience, not independent judgment, and defiance, even to prevent nuclear war, was often viewed as insubordination, especially when it resulted in exposure or embarrassment to the Soviet Navy. Upon returning home, instead of being welcomed as heroes, Arkhipov, Savitsky, and the entire crew were met with hostility. Senior officers berated them for failing their mission, for allowing themselves to be forced to surface, and even for panic, accusations that were not only unfair, but deeply ironic given the conditions the men had endured. And while no one was executed or imprisoned, the reprimands were severe enough to derail several careers. Archipov's file was marked by the incident, limiting his advancement for years, and according to testimony from post-Soviet interviews, some naval commanders privately referred to him as the man who disobeyed, a label that haunted him long before the West learned of his heroism. Meanwhile, as the world celebrated the peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, political leaders and intelligence analysts remained unaware of just how close the confrontation had come to becoming a nuclear holocaust. The Kennedy administration believed war had been avoided due to careful diplomacy and military restraint. But behind closed doors, U.S. Navy officers later admitted they had not realized the Soviet submarines were armed with nuclear torpedoes. Had they known, their use of depth signal charges would have been unthinkable, and simple miscommunication could have led to retaliatory American strikes, triggering the nightmare scenario the world had feared since the dawn of the atomic age. And yet, through all of this, Arkhipov never sought recognition or fame. He rarely spoke about the incident, even to close family members, maintaining the stoic silence typical of Cold War officers and carrying the psychological weight of that day quietly for the rest of his life. What makes Archipov's story even more extraordinary is that he did not simply prevent a nuclear strike. He prevented a chain reaction. Had B-59 launched its nuclear torpedo at the USS Randolph, or one of the nearby destroyers, American leadership would have almost certainly assumed the Soviet Union had initiated nuclear war, and the United States had strategic bombers, Polaris submarines, and missile batteries poised for immediate retaliation. Within hours, major Soviet cities could have been hit, prompting counterattacks on American bases in Europe. And once the spiral began, it would have been nearly impossible to stop. The most chilling part is that none of the men aboard B-59 would have witnessed the destruction. They would have died within minutes of firing, consumed by American retaliation, or crushed as their submarine sank under explosive pressure, and their act, born from exhaustion and misinterpretation, would have destroyed civilization without ever knowing the full consequence. Arkhipov prevented that not through force, authority, or ideological conviction, but through clarity of mind in a moment where every environmental, psychological, and emotional factor pushed toward catastrophe, and it is this aspect of his story, the sheer fragility of human decision-making under nuclear tension, that underscores why his actions are now studied by military historians, nuclear policy experts, and strategists around the world. The chilling truth is that humanity survived October 27, 1962, not because of systems, treaties, or protocols, but because one exhausted, dehydrated, overheated naval officer maintained his composure when two others could not, and because he held the power to veto a launch that would have erased entire nations. And still, after returning home, he received no medals, no commendation, not even a formal note of gratitude. it would take nearly 40 years and the collapse of the Soviet Union for the world to finally learn what he had done. In the decades following the Cuban Missile Crisis, while the world celebrated the supposed brilliance of Kennedy's diplomacy and Khrushchev's reluctant compromise, the truth of what occurred inside B-59 remained buried within layers of Soviet secrecy, and the name Vasily Arkhipov disappeared into obscurity, known only within narrow naval circles as a competent but unremarkable officer. Yet his story was quietly whispered among submarine veterans, many of whom understood that the official narrative, that B-59 had simply been forced to surface due to overheating batteries, was a sanitized half-truth designed to preserve the dignity of the Soviet Navy, which refused to admit how dangerously close its command structure had come to total collapse under the pressure of U.S. naval harassment and the harsh tropical environment. Meanwhile, the Soviet leadership deliberately avoided discussing the subject at all, because acknowledging that a single submarine, operating without reliable communication under extreme physical and psychological strain, was carrying a nuclear weapon whose launch depended largely on human judgment, would have exposed the fragility of Soviet nuclear command and control systems, which at the time were far less stable and far less centralized than the USSR claimed publicly, and far more susceptible to miscalculation or unauthorized action. In the years after the crisis, Arkhipov continued to serve quietly, eventually becoming deputy commander of the Kirov Naval Academy, where he trained young officers, many of whom later testified that his lectures focused obsessively on restraint, discipline, and the importance of clear communication under stress. He rarely spoke of his own experiences, but he would constantly warn that chaos is the enemy of judgment, and that a submarine without communication is a blind animal, statements that carried far deeper meaning than his students realized at the time, especially given that the Soviet Navy had begun to modernize rapidly, introducing new ballistic missile submarines that increased the stakes of any misinterpretation or mechanical failure. Meanwhile, the United States, unaware of Archipov's role or even the presence of nuclear torpedoes on the Foxtrot submarines, continued to refine its anti-submarine warfare techniques, convinced that the depth charges used during the quarantine were harmless signaling devices. But post-Cold War interviews with Soviet survivors revealed that the U.S. Navy had grossly underestimated the psychological and physical impact of those detonations. The small explosions reverberated inside the submarine at painful decibel levels, rattling equipment, shaking loose ceiling panels, and triggering alarms that sounded identical to those that signaled catastrophic hull breaches, meaning that the crew of B-59 believed they were under direct attack, not because they were irrational, but because the acoustic environment inside a submerged submarine amplifies every shockwave into a violent jolt that feels indistinguishable from incoming weapons fire. And once this misinterpretation set in, panic became unavoidable. Sailors reported being unable to hear commands over the sound of metal vibrating violently. Some suffered temporary hearing loss, and others believed the submarine had already been hit and was sinking, which contributed to the emotional spiral that pushed Captain Savitsky toward ordering the nuclear torpedo to be armed, demonstrating just how narrow the margin between peace and nuclear devastation truly was, and how easily human beings in extreme environments can misread intentions and escalate to lethal conclusions. As historians examined these details, one theme emerged. Arkhipov did not save the world because he was trained to do so, but because he possessed an extraordinary level of emotional stability that allowed him to override the panic of others and impose logic where logic had collapsed. And the more intelligence experts studied the incident, the more horrifying the implications became, because it revealed that nuclear war during the Cold War was not prevented by stable systems or carefully crafted treaties, but by luck, timing, and the presence, or absence, of psychologically resilient individuals placed randomly throughout a vast nuclear machine. To underscore how dangerous this reality was, you only need to look at the internal Soviet reaction. Instead of investigating how such a near disaster could happen, instead of improving submarine cooling systems or revising nuclear torpedo authorization procedures, the Soviet Navy simply classified the entire event, reassigned certain officers, and pretended nothing had happened. A decision reflecting an institutional culture more concerned with avoiding embarrassment than preventing future catastrophe. And this secrecy meant that for decades afterward, Western strategists continued operating under the false assumption that Soviet submarines were tightly controlled, well-cooled, and psychologically prepared for tropical operations, when in reality, the conditions aboard those foxtrots were so horrific that one wrong sound, one wrong shockwave, or one wrong interpretation could have unleashed a nuclear strike without any input from Moscow. The deeper you examine the incident, the more Archipov's refusal looks less like a heroic stand and more like a direct contradiction of Soviet naval doctrine, which emphasized aggressive retaliation, unwavering obedience, and willingness to escalate in the face of Western provocation. Yet Arkhipov had seen, on K-19, how blind obedience could lead to destruction, and he was one of the few officers who understood that survival sometimes required defying emotion, defying pressure, defying even orders, and drawing a line where his comrades could not, even at the risk of his own life or career. In the years that followed, Arkhipov suffered from ongoing health problems, likely connected to his radiation exposure on K-19, including kidney complications and chronic physiological stress, and he remained largely unrecognized by the Soviet government, which discouraged public discussion of the Cuban Missile Crisis and suppressed nearly all accounts involving unauthorized nuclear decision-making. As a result, Arkhipov died in 1998, without fully knowing the scale of his impact, never having received a medal or state honor for preventing nuclear war, and never hearing Western leaders openly acknowledge his role. It was only in 2002, at a conference in Havana involving former U.S. and Soviet officials, that retired Soviet commanders finally revealed the existence of the nuclear torpedo and Archipov's veto. Shocking American diplomats, military historians, and nuclear strategists who had spent 40 years believing the crisis had been controlled, predictable, and manageable, when in reality it had balanced on the edge of human exhaustion and miscommunication. One American historian later wrote that learning about Arkhipov felt like discovering the missing chapter of the Cold War. The chapter where the world survived not because of institutional wisdom, but because a single man stayed calm inside a boiling metal coffin 5 stories beneath the ocean. After this revelation, Arkhipov was posthumously honored by several international organizations, including the Future of Life Institute, which awarded him recognition for the most important individual contribution to the survival of humanity. A phrase that sounds exaggerated until you understand the physics of nuclear escalation and how a single torpedo launch on October 27, 1962, could have triggered the destruction of Washington, New York, Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, London, Paris, and countless other cities within hours, leaving behind a nuclear winter that would have collapsed agriculture, poisoned oceans, and rendered the earth nearly uninhabitable for human civilization. What makes Archipov's story so unsettling is not only how close we came to catastrophe, but how little anyone knew at the time. Kennedy did not know. Khrushchev did not know, the Pentagon did not know, and even high-ranking Soviet admirals were unaware that their submarine captains might be pressured into using nuclear torpedoes without clear orders, meaning that the fate of the world was not decided by presidents, generals, or diplomats, but by the mental stability of a few exhausted submariners who had been instructed to operate in conditions that humans were never meant to endure. In retrospect, Archipov's calm refusal appears almost superhuman, a psychological anomaly that prevented global annihilation, and yet he was a quiet, modest man who seemed unaware of how uniquely composed he was in crisis, a man who simply believed that escalation without certainty was insanity. And perhaps that is why his story resonates so powerfully today, because it exposes a truth that nuclear powers still struggle to accept, that our safety does not come from weapons or deterrence or threat calculations, but from fragile human judgment under impossible pressure, and that the next Arkhipov might not appear when needed, because individuals like him are extraordinarily rare. As the world reflects on the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Archipov's role stands as one of the clearest reminders that peace is not the natural outcome of political systems, but the product of human choices, sometimes made in places the world never sees, inside cramped steel compartments, in suffocating darkness, by people whose names history nearly forgot. As the truth of B-59 slowly emerged in the post-Cold War era, researchers began digging deeper into the psychological, structural, and technological failures that nearly caused nuclear war, and what they found only made Archipov's restraint more extraordinary, because almost every system surrounding him had been designed in a way that increased the likelihood of disaster rather than preventing it. The Soviet Navy's strategic doctrine at the time prioritized secrecy and offensive readiness over safety and clarity, which meant that submarine captains were routinely kept in the dark about political developments. Communications technology was primitive and easily disrupted, and nuclear weapons aboard tactical vessels were governed by authorization procedures that were shockingly ambiguous, allowing for broad interpretation under stress. Intelligence reports later revealed that even the officers aboard B-59 were unsure whether they were supposed to use the nuclear torpedo only in retaliation to confirmed enemy attack, or whether they had permission to launch if they believed they were in imminent danger. An uncertainty so dangerous that American nuclear experts reacted with disbelief when they learned how loosely the Soviets controlled their special weapons. The tropical conditions only amplified this unpredictability. The Foxtrot-class submarines were notorious for poor ventilation and excessive heat buildup, and Soviet engineers had issued internal reports warning that prolonged operations in warm waters could lead to equipment failure, combustible gas accumulation, and dangerously high carbon dioxide levels. Yet those warnings were ignored by naval leaders who wanted the deployment to Cuba to appear bold, confident, and technologically advanced, even though the subs themselves were never designed to withstand such environmental extremes, making their mission inherently unstable from the moment it began. Crew members described how their skin blistered from the heat radiating off machinery, how condensation dripped constantly from ceilings, how electrical panels sparked at random, and how batteries emitted choking fumes that made breathing painful. And when the depth charges began detonating outside the hull, the atmosphere inside the submarine became so terrifying that even veteran officers struggled to maintain composure, with some admitting years later that they were convinced the Americans were attacking with lethal intent. It was in this environment, under crushing physiological stress, inside a sweltering, vibrating submarine, teetering on the edge of mechanical failure, that Arkhipov held the line against global catastrophe, and yet, perhaps the most shocking aspect of the entire incident is that he had no guarantee that surfacing would save the crew, because surfacing exposed the submarine to potential capture or destruction, and the Americans had already been operating under extreme tension, unsure whether the Soviet submarines might attack, meaning Arkhipov was not choosing between safety and risk, but between two different forms of danger: an immediate nuclear launch that would have annihilated millions, or surfacing to face an unpredictable enemy with superior firepower. His decision was not based on faith in American restraint, but on a recognition that a nuclear strike without complete certainty was a monstrous mistake, and his responsibility to global survival outweighed even his duty to obey the Soviet chain of command, a perspective almost unheard of within the deeply authoritarian structure of the USSR's military. What intelligence analysts later realized is that Archipov's psychological profile was incredibly rare. He was not impulsive like Savitsky, not ideological like Maslenikov, not panicked like the junior officers, and not arrogant like many Soviet naval commanders. He possessed the uncommon ability to detach his emotions from the chaos around him and make a decision based purely on logic, even while his body was overheating and deprived of oxygen, an ability that modern military psychologists describe as cognitive steadiness under existential stress, a trait so rare that only a small percentage of elite special operations personnel display it consistently, and even fewer maintain it in life-threatening, physically debilitating environments. And yet, despite this extraordinary composure, the Soviet Navy's treatment of Arkhipov upon his return remained harsh, because the incident did more than embarrass the Kremlin. It exposed fundamental weaknesses in Soviet nuclear policy, weaknesses so severe that had they been revealed publicly, they would have undermined the USSR's projection of military competence and strategic discipline. Instead of using Archipov's experience to reform submarine operations, Soviet leadership chose denial, burying reports, classifying logs, and aggressively discouraging discussion of nuclear torpedoes within tactical submarine units, a decision that left future crews just as vulnerable to miscommunication and panic as those aboard B-59. This culture of secrecy stemmed directly from the USSR's Cold War doctrine, which relied heavily on political illusion, projecting strength outward while concealing internal failures. And because admitting near disaster would weaken that illusion, Archipov's heroism was rendered invisible for decades, even as his decision continued to ripple quietly through nuclear policy circles, reshaping the way Western strategists viewed Soviet stability. American historians who studied the incident were stunned to discover that Arkhipov had essentially acted as the sole barrier between global annihilation and survival, and this realization triggered a re-evaluation of Cold War narratives that had long portrayed nuclear deterrence as a carefully controlled, rational balance between two superpowers, when in truth it was a chaotic, unpredictable system held together by the emotional resilience of individuals placed in impossible situations. Some analysts argued that deterrence worked because neither side wanted war, but Archipov's story exposed the darker reality. Deterrence nearly failed not because leaders wanted war, but because their systems were fragile, their weapons were decentralized, and their field commanders were often overwhelmed, misinformed, or psychologically compromised by the conditions in which they operated, which means humanity survived 1962 largely by accident. In the years since Archipov's story became public, military scholars have identified several other Soviet officers who acted heroically to prevent accidental nuclear war, such as Stanislav Petrov in 1983, and Lieutenant Colonel Yevgeny Vlasov in 1979. But Archipov's case remains the most extreme because he prevented the deliberate launch of an authorized nuclear weapon, a situation far more dangerous than false alarms or computer errors. Because once a nuclear torpedo detonated, American forces would have had no way of knowing the launch was unauthorized or unintentional. This is why experts now consider Arkhipov the most important person in human history you've never heard of, and why his story has become essential reading in nuclear military academies around the world. It demonstrates that nuclear weapons are not simply technological instruments subject to rational command, but human instruments subject to psychological chaos, environmental stress, and emotional breakdown, meaning no nation, however powerful, can ever guarantee stability when the use of nuclear force depends on the judgment of individuals operating in darkness, isolation, and fear. In this way, Archipov's refusal was more than a heroic act. It was a profound indictment of the nuclear strategies of both superpowers, because if a single torpedo officer's panic could nearly end civilization, then the entire edifice of nuclear deterrence rests on a foundation far more fragile than most people realize. As researchers continued to dig through declassified records, another unsettling truth emerged. Archipov's decision may have contradicted direct expectations of the Soviet General Staff, who believed their commanders were prepared to use nuclear weapons if attacked. And some documents suggest that certain senior officers expected at least one submarine to detonate its torpedo as a demonstration of Soviet resolve, a belief based not on strategy, but on the Soviet military's deeply ingrained obsession with projecting bravery and refusing to show weakness, even when logic demanded restraint. Had Savitsky launched the torpedo, he would have been celebrated posthumously as a martyr of Soviet strength, not condemned for triggering global destruction, because the Soviet propaganda machine would have framed the incident as noble self-sacrifice in the face of American aggression. Archipov's refusal, therefore, was not simply the prevention of nuclear war. It was direct defiance of a cultural and political system that valued obedience above survival, aggression above prudence, and image above truth. A refusal so radical that only after the collapse of the Soviet Union could historians fully appreciate how dangerous the internal pressures were within the Soviet Navy, and how astonishing it was that Arkhipov resisted them while suffocating inside a failing submarine. And yet, the world owes its existence to that resistance, because had Arkhipov agreed, had he remained silent, or had he faltered for even a moment, the torpedo would have been launched. American ships would have been vaporized. U.S. nuclear forces in the Atlantic would have retaliated instantly, and the Soviet leadership, already paranoid, misinformed, and feeling cornered, would have almost certainly responded with massive force, triggering a chain reaction of missile launches across both hemispheres. The terrifying conclusion is this: the survival of millions, perhaps billions, of people depended on the breath, heartbeat, and mental strength of a single man in a space smaller than a school bus, buried beneath the ocean, cut off from the world, under conditions that would have, yet, psychologically broken nearly anyone else alive. As the final years of the Cold War unfolded, the broader implications of Archipov's decision began to take shape in ways even he could never have imagined. Because while he lived the remainder of his life in modest obscurity, teaching naval discipline and emergency procedures at the Kirov Naval Academy, global nuclear policy was undergoing a gradual transformation, driven in part by rare cases like his. The unspoken truth that nuclear stability had never been guaranteed by deterrence theory alone but depended heavily on the unpredictable reactions of human operators placed in high-stress environments where misjudgments could ignite irreversible catastrophe. This realization, though not widely publicized, slowly permeated strategic circles in the Soviet Union and the West, prompting new discussions on command and control vulnerabilities, decentralized launch authority, and the psychological fragility of submarine crews. Yet even with these insights, the full story of B-59 remained locked away in Soviet archives, known only to a handful of naval insiders who recognized the incident as the closest point the world had ever come to nuclear war, closer even than the NORAD false alarm of 1979, closer than the 1983 Soviet early warning malfunction, closer than Able Archer, closer than any publicly known crisis. Arkhipov himself, a quiet and disciplined officer who never spoke publicly about the events of October 27th, carried the weight of his decision in silence, even as the Soviet Navy occasionally pressured him into retelling a sanitized version of the story for internal training sessions that omitted the nuclear torpedo entirely and framed the incident as a matter of tactical disagreement, a phrase so empty that it bordered on delusion. Meanwhile, many of his crew members suffered long-term psychological after-effects, including recurring nightmares, panic responses to sudden loud noises, and chronic respiratory issues caused by prolonged exposure to overheated, unventilated submarine air thick with diesel fumes, battery acid, and mold. Interviews conducted decades later reveal the depth of their trauma. Sailors described moments where they genuinely believed the hull was moments from imploding, where they felt certain the submarine had already been hit by American weapons, and where they accepted, some with tears, some with resignation, that they would die in darkness at the bottom of the ocean, never knowing whether the world above had already been destroyed by nuclear fire. Against this backdrop, Archipov's ability to think clearly appears almost supernatural, and modern psychologists who study crisis decision-making argue that only a tiny fraction of individuals possess the cognitive resilience required to remain rational under such conditions, especially when their bodies are undergoing severe heat stress and oxygen deprivation. What Arkhipov achieved was not simply an act of bravery, but an act of psychological endurance, one that required resisting not only his captain's emotional collapse, but also the intense cultural conditioning of the Soviet military, which emphasized loyalty to command, readiness to sacrifice, and rigid adherence to orders, even if those orders meant mutual annihilation. But the world did not learn this until after the Soviet Union disintegrated. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, researchers finally gained limited access to naval logs, survivor testimonies, and internal communications that revealed the true scale of the near disaster, and what they discovered sent shockwaves through Western intelligence agencies. The assumption, long held by American and European strategists, that Soviet nuclear weapons were tightly controlled and governed by robust centralized procedures, was shattered by the realization that a submarine captain, exhausted, dehydrated, psychologically unstable, came within seconds of launching a nuclear weapon based on a misinterpretation of depth charges intended merely as signals. This revelation forced a re-evaluation of Cold War risk calculations. If such a launch had occurred, U.S. forces in the Atlantic would have retaliated instantly, because their standing orders required them to treat any nuclear detonation against American assets as a deliberate act of war by the Soviet Union. And under the extreme tension of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Washington would have had no choice but to respond massively, triggering counterstrikes from Soviet missile bases, leading to cascading destruction across Europe, North America, and the Soviet Union. All because a submarine crew mistook signaling charges for hostile attack. The terrifying simplicity of this chain reaction became a key case study in nuclear ethics seminars and academic conferences throughout the 2000s, where scholars emphasized that humanity's survival had depended on the mental clarity of a single officer, which contradicted every assumption about rational state behavior that nuclear deterrence theory is built upon. In fact, Archipov's decision became the definitive example cited by critics who argue that nuclear weapons are inherently unsafe not because nations want war, but because misperceptions, accidents, and human emotions make perfect control impossible. Yet Arkhipov himself never saw any of this analysis. He died in 1998 of kidney complications, likely worsened by radiation exposure from the K-19 reactor accident, and was buried with minimal ceremony, his heroism largely unknown even within his home country. His widow, Olga, later revealed in interviews that he never spoke about the Cuban Missile Crisis at home, never described the moment he saved the world, and rarely discussed his naval career at all, maintaining the secrecy expected of Soviet officers until his death. It was only after international researchers uncovered declassified Soviet records and cross-referenced them with U.S. Navy logs that the full truth emerged. Arkhipov had not just disagreed with his captain, but had single-handedly prevented the launch of a nuclear torpedo during the most dangerous moment in human history. When this information finally reached the public, Arkhipov was posthumously honored with awards from several peace organizations, his name added to global discussions on nuclear safety, and his story shared widely in documentaries, books, and academic papers. Yet even these accolades felt small compared to the magnitude of what he had prevented, because no other recorded decision in human history can be directly linked to the survival of so many millions, perhaps even billions, of lives. The uncomfortable reality, acknowledged by nuclear experts today, is that Archipov's calmness should never have been required. The systems should have been designed to prevent a single officer from carrying such responsibility. The submarines should have been built to withstand tropical heat. The communication protocols should have been robust enough to prevent isolation, and the authorization rules for nuclear torpedoes should have been unambiguous. But because none of these safeguards existed, humanity survived solely because one man refused to panic when everyone around him did. And that brings us to the final, haunting truth of Archipov's legacy. He revealed that nuclear deterrence is not a stable, self-regulating system, but a dangerous illusion, one that depends on the psychological state of individuals trapped inside machines designed to kill on unimaginable scale. If Arkhipov had been slightly more exhausted, slightly more dehydrated, slightly more frightened, or slightly less confident in his judgment, the world today would be unrecognizable if it existed at all. Cities would lie in ruin, the global climate would have collapsed into nuclear winter, and human civilization would have been thrown back centuries or extinguished entirely. Instead, we live in a world where people can argue philosophy, stream movies, start businesses, and raise families. Because Vasily Arkhipov, in a moment of unbearable heat, noise, and confusion, said the word no. It is difficult to overstate what that meant and how improbable it was, and that is why historians now describe Archipov's decision as the closest humanity has ever come to annihilation and the greatest act of individual courage in the history of the world. Because unlike political leaders who made decisions from safe rooms thousands of miles away, Arkhipov made his decision while suffocating, blinded by sweat, surrounded by chaos, and gripped by the very real fear that the world above might already be burning. His calmness is the reason it wasn't. And so the final, inescapable conclusion is this: The world did not survive the Cuban Missile Crisis because leaders were wise or systems were sound. It survived because Vasily Arkhipov was there, inside B-59, at the exact moment humanity needed him most. In the years after Vasily Archipov's role was finally revealed, scholars, military leaders, and nuclear policy experts began to re-examine the entire framework of Cold War history through a new lens. Because Archipov's story didn't just highlight a near miss, it exposed a fundamental truth about the nuclear age that both superpowers had spent decades ignoring, which is that the machinery of nuclear deterrence, no matter how advanced or carefully theorized, always collapses back onto human psychology, and that the fate of entire nations can hinge on the emotional state, personal judgment, and physical condition of individuals trapped inside situations far beyond their control. Archipov's decision forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the world's survival in 1962 depended not on national strategy, diplomatic brilliance, or technological safeguards, but on a single man's ability to remain calm while his body was overheating, his lungs were struggling for oxygen, and his captain was screaming to fire a nuclear torpedo. And as historians reflected on this, they realized how fragile global peace truly was during the Cold War. Not because leaders wanted war, but because miscommunication, paranoia, equipment failure, and human exhaustion created countless points where the system could have collapsed. Archipov's submarine was just one of many such points, but his was the moment where collapse would have been irreversible. It is easy to look back on the Cuban Missile Crisis and see the final agreement between Kennedy and Khrushchev as evidence that human beings will always pull back from destruction when the stakes are high enough. But Archipov's story proves that this is a myth, because neither leader knew how close their militaries had come to triggering global annihilation, and neither understood that at the height of their negotiations, a Soviet submarine commander under psychological and environmental duress had nearly launched a nuclear strike that would have destroyed any diplomatic solution before it could take effect. This is why modern nuclear scholars argue that Archipov's decision should be taught in every military academy, every political science department, every strategic studies program, because it demonstrates that nuclear weapons are fundamentally incompatible with human psychology. Not because humans are evil or careless, but because no human being, no matter how well trained, is designed to make perfect decisions under extreme fear, extreme heat, extreme stress, or extreme isolation. And the moment you put a nuclear weapon into an environment where those conditions are possible, you create a scenario where the world can be destroyed by accident. Arkhipov himself never sought recognition for preventing that accident. He remained a quiet, private man who rarely spoke of his experiences, and according to his family, he didn't believe he had done anything extraordinary. He simply believed he had done what was necessary and that launching a nuclear weapon without absolute certainty of war would have been immoral and catastrophic. Yet this humility only makes his story more powerful because it reveals a truth often overlooked in discussions of global conflict, that the individuals who save the world are often not the ones with the most power, not the ones in command centers or presidential offices, but the ones placed unexpectedly in moments where every instinct around them urges disaster, and who somehow find the clarity to resist. In the decades since Archipov's death, his legacy has grown steadily as more people learn the full scope of what he prevented, and today he is widely considered one of the greatest unsung heroes of the 20th century. A man whose single decision preserved the possibility of human civilization continuing. A man whose courage was not loud or dramatic, but quiet, deliberate, and rooted in a deep sense of responsibility to life itself. His story casts a shadow over modern nuclear policy, reminding us that despite technological improvements, automation, and more centralized command systems, the risk of miscommunication and human error has not gone away. If anything, the existence of faster missiles, more complex early warning networks, and tighter geopolitical tensions increase the chances that a future crisis might depend, once again, on the judgment of an individual caught in a moment of impossible pressure. That is why Archipov's story matters, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a warning, a reminder that the nuclear age is fragile, unstable, and constantly dependent on human beings who can fail, panic, or misunderstand, and that the only reason the world survived October 27th, 1962, is because one man in the bowels of a failing submarine refused to surrender to panic. Today, as nations continue to build and modernize nuclear arsenals, Archipov's legacy stands as a counter-argument to every justification for nuclear weapons, because no matter how carefully they are controlled, no matter how sophisticated their systems, no matter how rational their leaders, the moment of decision always collapses back onto a human being who must act under fear, confusion, and incomplete information. Arkhipov was the rare exception, the man who stayed calm, the man who thought clearly, the man who held the line. But there is no guarantee that the next crisis will place such a person in the right place at the right time. And if humanity is ever undone by nuclear war, it will not be because leaders wanted destruction, but because someone, somewhere, under conditions they were never meant to endure, believed they had no choice but to act. The world survived 1962 because Vasily Arkhipov believed otherwise. And everything we have today, every city still standing, every family line unbroken, every life lived in the decades since, is tied to that belief, that moment, and that man. His legacy is not merely the story of a heroic decision. It is the story of the razor-thin thread on which civilization hangs, and the reminder that sometimes the most powerful act in history is a single word spoken in darkness. No.